Welcome back, everybody. Today we're going to be looking at the long-run implications of fiscal policy. Last time we looked at the tools of fiscal policy related to changes in taxes and changes in spending. Today we're going to look at the consequences of those decisions in terms of government debt. So we'll look at what the budget balance is and how it's measured. And we're going to look at the impact that fiscal policy has on what's known as the loanable funds market. So we start by talking about the budget balance, and the budget balance is government savings. It's looking at total taxes coming in and subtracting from the taxes that are coming in government spending and transfer payments. So the T is taxes, G is government spending, and that TR is transfer payments. So money coming in minus money going out. If you have more money coming in than going out, you have positive savings. We call that a budget surplus. If you have more going out than coming in, you have a negative government savings rate, and we refer to that as a deficit. Depending on what fiscal policy the government is implementing, you're going to see an impact on government savings. Let's assume that the economy is in a recessionary gap. You may want to take a moment to draw the recessionary gap on a sheet of paper and try and think through what are some of the fiscal policy options that the government could pursue to close that gap. And then think for a little bit about what those policies might do to the overall budget balance. Would it move us towards deficit or surplus? So take a minute to sort of work through that scenario, hit pause, and when you're ready, press play, and we'll see how you did. If the economy is in a recessionary gap, then proper fiscal policy is designed to increase aggregate demand, to get more spending. So what we would do is increase government spending. We would increase government transfers, that is, put money directly into the hands of consumers so they can spend more money. Or we would reduce taxes, which would also free up money in the hands of consumers to buy goods and services. All of those would increase aggregate demand. All of those tools would lead the budget balance toward deficit. We would be increasing the amount of money we're spending, holding taxes constant. That would reduce our budget savings and lead us towards deficit. Or we would be reducing the amount of money coming in and holding spending the same. And again, that has the same effect. It leads us towards deficit. It reduces government savings and almost certainly drives it negative. So what are the consequences of that decision? Well, our decision to pursue particularly expansionary fiscal policy has an impact on what's known as the loanable funds market and can lead to a situation known as crowding out. The loanable funds market is a market we're going to basically, for simplicity, pretend that all loans are going to be done within this single market. So home loans, car loans, student loans, we're just going to aggregate them all together into this thing we're going to call the loanable funds market. The price of the loanable funds market is known as the real interest rate. It's taking into account expected inflation. And so it's more of a long-term interest rate than you have in the money market that we talked about when we did monetary policy. So the vertical axis is the real interest rate, or R. Horizontal is the quantity of loanable funds. The price, the real interest rate, will be determined by the intersection of the supply of loanable funds and the demand for loanable funds. The demand for loanable funds is based on your rate of return. If the interest rate is high, there will be fewer loanable funds demanded because you're going to have to get a much higher rate of return to justify the loan. The lower the interest rate that you have to pay for the loan, the greater the quantity of loanable funds you would like to take out, because it means a greater opportunity for profit. So it's a downward sloping demand curve like it is for every other demand curve we've ever studied. The higher the price, the lower the quantity demanded. The lower the price, the greater the quantity demanded. So demand will shift based on our changes in business opportunities or government spending. If we see an increase in business opportunities, if we think we have an opportunity to earn more profit by borrowing money and pursuing multiple projects, then there will be an increase in the demand for loans. That increase will shift demand to the right, and cause the price of loans, the real interest rate, to rise. Same thing with changes in government borrowing. If the government borrows more money, then the demand for loans increases, also causing the interest rate to rise. The opposite is true if there's a reduction in opportunities or government spending. It would cause demand to shift to the left and interest rates would fall. The supply of loanable funds represents foregone consumption. People are putting money into the banking system and receiving interest for their deposits. And so the higher the interest rate that you can receive for your money, the more likely you are to make money available to lend out to other people. You're not going to be able to spend it because you're letting somebody else spend it. And so the way to compensate you is to give you a higher rate of interest. The lower the interest rate, the greater the opportunity cost of lending the money out, because I could be using it for my own purposes rather than letting you borrow it. So we see an upward sloping curve for the supply of loanable funds. The higher the interest rate, the greater the quantity of loanable funds available. What's going to cause a shift in the supply of loanable funds? Well, one is an increase or a decrease in private savings. The other would be what we call capital inflows or outflows. That is money from outside the United States or outside of your country, either coming in for investing inside of the country or leaving this country and going to a different country with a better investment opportunity. So if, for example, we are saving more money as a people, there will be a greater amount of money put into the banking system, which means there's a greater amount of money available to be lent out. And the same thing is true if there are inflows. If people from around the world decide to put their money in our banking system, there's more money in the system, more money available to be lent, and so the increase in supply leads to a reduction in the interest rates within the market. And if we happen to be saving less, or if we saw money flowing out of our country and into a different country, there would be less money in the banking system, a reduction in the supply of loanable funds, a left shift causing interest rates to rise. So all of this leads us to the question, what impact does fiscal policy have on the loanable funds market? What impact does expansionary fiscal policy have on the economy? And so what we know, or what we learn, is that expansionary fiscal policy drives the budget balance towards deficit and can lead to a concept known as crowding out. Crowding out occurs when there's an increase in government spending that leads to higher interest rates. Those higher interest rates results in less private borrowing occurring because private borrowers are crowded out, squeezed out of the market. How does it work? Well, if the government borrows more money, let's say we're at longer equilibrium now, the government borrows more money, there'll be an increase in the demand for loanable funds. The increase in demand is entirely, in this situation, driven by the increase in government spending. So if the government is spending more money, it's shifting the demand curve horizontally by however much more money the government is spending or needing to borrow. The result of that is an increase in interest rates. Businesses aren't willing to pay a higher interest rate because the only reason they want to pay a higher interest rate is because they believe they're going to get a higher rate of return. But their expectations for the rate of return haven't changed any. They're still the same. So this increase in interest rate is driven not because they think that they'll make more money, but because the government needs to borrow more money. And so businesses are only going to borrow when the rate of return is equal to or greater than the interest rate. The interest rate has risen. Rate of returns have remained the same. And so there are a certain number of projects that businesses were going to borrow to pay for because they thought they'd make a profit at that original interest rate. But now that the interest rate has risen, those projects are no longer profitable. And we see a reduction in private borrowing. We went from Q0, total borrowing, before the government increased its spending and increased its borrowing. Total loans moved to Q1, but private spending has reduced back to Q private spending, or QPS. They've been squeezed out of the market. They've been crowded out due to the increase in interest rate. And this has a consequence for long-run economic growth because it's investment spending that leads to long-run economic growth, which we'll see in a future lesson. So is government debt a problem? Is expansionary fiscal policy problematic and not worth the cost? Well, no, not necessarily. I'm not saying that. We need to look at some numbers. The number we're most concerned about is what's known as public debt, the amount of money held by individuals and institutions. It's currently about $25 trillion in the United States. And that public debt is typically expressed as a percent of GDP. So it's currently at about 100% of gross domestic product. That number is called the debt to GDP ratio. And the higher the debt to GDP ratio, the more difficult it is for an economy to finance its debt. So the higher the number, the more concerning government debt is. Not completely unmanageable, but certainly of a greater concern. So is the increasing amount of government debt a problem? Well, yes and no. On the no side, government debt has enabled the government to provide services to people that they want and services that they may need, especially during COVID, where the government accumulated trillions and trillions of dollars of debt, but in exchange, they were able to help keep the economy afloat when there were lockdowns. So increasing government debt is not always bad, but it does also create some challenges because that debt creates future financial pressure. The government has to pay back its debt, and it has to pay back its debt with interest. And so what ends up happening is the government has to borrow money to pay back the money it borrowed previously. It creates sort of a vicious cycle, and it becomes increasingly more and more difficult to get out of debt. And the other challenge here is that it does take away funds for future projects. If money is going towards interest, it cannot also go towards whatever other future needs you may have. So you may have to end up having to borrow more to finance all the things that you want to do as a country. So there are some challenges here with accumulating large amounts of debt through expansionary fiscal policy. One other thing to keep in mind when it comes to long-run implications of fiscal policy is that we have what are known as implicit liabilities. That is future spending that we've promised that we haven't really had to borrow money for yet. And so it's not part of our national debt, but it will be part of our national debt eventually. So implicit liabilities might include, for example, Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security commitments that have been made to retirees. We've promised people that they're going to get paid when they retire. They haven't retired yet, so we don't have to pay them yet, but we will when they do retire. And these liabilities, like Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, currently make up about 50% of our overall budget. And it's been estimated by some economists that we'll need to add an additional $71 trillion in debt over the next 75 years to meet all of the obligations we've made and promises we've made to people just on those programs alone, assuming there's no change in the law. So implicit liabilities are something to be concerned about because it does mean even more debt than we may realize just looking at the numbers as they are right now. Again, doesn't mean that it's wrong or bad, but it does mean that there are some challenges or consequences that result from using expansionary fiscal policy. Next time we'll talk more about the consequences of fiscal policy, particularly related to inflation, and I will talk to you then.